Wow, well, that's a big question. My vision for education and care. I guess my vision, if we think blue sky thinking in Australia, is that children are at the forefront of the thinking around policy decisions that are made in the education and care sector, and around all of those decisions that politicians make, rather than thinking about other drivers that we currently have in place, like women's workforce participation and economic drivers. Wouldn't it be lovely if children were put at the centre of that, and best outcomes for children were the drivers for those decisions? So I guess that's my vision for education and care in Australia.
Thinking back to the ECW Valuing Educators Conference and listening to educators and to our consultants and panel, one of which was yourself, that was predominantly where the whole room settled, wasn't it? Around ensuring that children were at the centre of our vision for education and care.
Yeah, and I think that's probably understandable, because people who are working in education and care services with children generally put children at the forefront of their thinking. That's their day-to-day work, that's their core business. But when we shift that to people who make decisions, who are in decision-making positions like politicians and policymakers, their drivers are quite different. So I think for a sector that means that we actually have to stand up and make ourselves heard and talk about the importance of putting children at the forefront of our thinking, both for childhood but also for the future. Yeah.
Because the implications, as we know, for children not having those opportunities, those rich early learning environments and those relationships in those early years, has significant impacts for society, for the individuals, long term.
Absolutely, and the research is really clear about that. And I don't think, it's not as if governments don't know that, because they've heard that message over and over again. But governments change, politicians change, people come and go, and I think as a sector we have to be really vigilant in keeping that message at the forefront, which is sometimes exhausting and tiring for people to do, but we have to keep sending that message, and we have to keep hammering home the research. As a sector, we know and understand the research, but I think we have to be much more proactive in sharing that research, both with decision makers but also more broadly in the community. With families and colleagues and other stakeholders working with children and in that space. Yeah, definitely. I think if we want families to be our allies and we want community to be our allies, then we have to share with them the value of the work that we do, and not just assume that they know and understand it. Because, I often say when I'm working with teachers and educators, why would they necessarily know and understand the value of our work? Just as you don't get a parenting manual when you have a child, nor do you get a manual when you enrol a child in an education and care service. So why would parents necessarily know the value of what we do unless we're able to articulate that with them? There
are often parallels drawn between what educators do and parenting, which contributes to the perception that qualifications aren't required to do the work that we do. What would be your response to that?
Yes, we do have that pervading view and public perception, and not only a public perception, but we have senators like David Leyonhjelm who openly spruik that kind of perception and this view that caring for children is something that's innately maternal, and that any pretty much woman can do that. And this is where I often think about this idea and talk to educators about this idea of really leaning into their professional space and really harnessing the educational nature of the work that they do. And not just assuming that it's understood. I think we do that sometimes. We assume that people understand that we're caring for children, but we're also educating children. But we have to really make that very clear. What is the research and the evidence that supports our work? educators draw on that all the time, but I think filling in that theory into practice gap is really important. How are they going to talk about the way that they do that with families and with the community? Well, the barriers are some of those things that we talked about. And I mean, they're opportunities and they're barriers.
Yes.
So the perception of the education and care sector, I think at a political level, the barriers are our political system in Australia. You know, governments are not looking at beyond the period when they're in term. So when we run those arguments with them about the long-term benefits of education and care, you know, it's hard for them to see value in those arguments because they're thinking about what that means from the perspective of their party.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would like to see bipartisan support where children are placed at the centre of policy making, and there's kind of some bipartisan decision making across political parties where they can actually say children need to come first.
Yes.
And all of our decisions are framed around that. It's certainly not the case at the moment.
No. So you've touched there on your recommendations. So the recommendations are, you know, that bipartisan support where children are placed at the forefront, and that our education and care system is there for the children, and not just to get women into the workforce to contribute to the, you know, gross economic.
Yeah. And that is the position that we're in at the moment in Australia. That is the driver behind the market that education and care has been positioned in, that kind of market perspective. And wouldn't it be nice to shift to a place, again, that blue sky thinking, and thinking about nirvana, where as with some Scandinavian countries, where their policy making is framed around family, around children, around supporting families in that really important period in a child's life, because they understand the value of that over a lifetime. Yeah.
And that actually moves it out of that blue, you know, while we're talking about it being a blue sky space, it is a reality in some countries. So it's not completely out of the possibilities or the realms of possibility.
No, I don't think it's completely out of the realms of possibility. It's certainly a different frame that we work in here in Australia, and I think it requires us as a profession and as a sector to stand up, to be vigilant about the messages that we send, and to be really resilient and persevere with that messaging that we bring to government and we bring to decision makers and policy makers. So we talk about children being resilient in our framework and persistence in our framework, and I think as a sector we need to be resilient and not just throw our hands up in the air, which sometimes happens, and it's absolutely understandable because the landscape is constantly changing, and it's easy to say it's way too hard.
Yes.
And it is hard. But we have to keep at it. We have to keep chipping away at it. Yeah.
So another recommendation is for the workforce to lean into their profession.
Absolutely.
And to advocate strongly for what they know is quality outcomes for children, but also for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And to support each other in that process.
Yeah.
We have, I mean, you know, Lee, too, that the complexity around training organisations, around TAFE, around universities, around how educators come to us when they first come to us in centres, and the high kind of turnover rate of educators. Which says to me that as a workforce, we need to build those supports around each other. If we had learning communities in centres where educators were supported, so the Certificate 3 educator that comes into our centre has that learning community and buffer around them, then maybe we might retain them. So taking some responsibility for that as a sector as well. And
that's a lovely place to leave that, because I would like to see our education and care workforce supported so that they have the resilience and the buffer to advocate for themselves and to advocate for children. So
absolutely.
Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your contribution to our discussions, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you.